Momentum started as a maquette, a small version where I worked out my ideas, the general motion and the placement of the limbs. I submitted it to Janelia Farm's sculpture committee, and they chose it and this light well in the reception area as the designated site. Using the maquette to guide us, Abel Welding and I made an armature, a steel stick figure roughly in the same position. These are the bones that support the chicken wire that I used to create the surfaces of the sculpture. French chicken wire is the best because the strands have been soldered together so it doesn't fall apart when cut. This means I can extend it by weaving in more pieces, create bulges by pushing it or pulling it out, and contract it by pinching it together. And I can change it again and again. Once I'd worked out my shapes, more or less, I moved on to covering them with wax. The first step was dipping interfacing into melted wax to make thin strips, like wax paper. These I laid over the chicken wire and then joined them with a hot tool. They don't actually stick to the wire, so I used clothespins to keep them in place. Essentially, I was making a skin that I could remove and replace when needed. At this point, there seemed like an endless amount of surface to cover. So I kept adding strips, and more strips, as I started with the torso and worked outwards. Everything looked different once the surfaces were solid and not lacy chicken wire. Enlarging Momentum from maquette size to monster size meant I had much more space to work with and could do more interesting things. I decided to make two separate surfaces for each part of the body. The two halves would combine to define the whole form. They would add to the sense of movement by twisting around each other, connecting, then separating and moving on. Getting those forms to touch in the right places and still read as the chest or leg or back from all angles was the hard part. Each evening before I left, I would stand back and look at the sculpture as a whole. Sometimes the torso would look too flat or the thighs too bulky, or the limbs needed to be twisted around more. Sometimes I didn't know, but just pushed and pulled until it looked better. Each change meant I had to fix the underlying armature and chicken wire, so many times I ended up with more skin off the piece than on. But Momentum did progress, so next I had to work on the negative spaces and the edges, and make sure that they added to the sense of the sculpture. For instance, I had to distinguish the chest from the left leg, but keep the swirl of the edge leading the eye around to the foot. Even small changes made an amazing difference. Lastly, there was the head, just as difficult as the rest. And then one day, to my surprise, the skin was done. Now I was ready to build up the thickness and strength of the wax. The first layer went on hot and thin, fusing the strips together before cooling down to form a hard base. Then I added cooler, mushier wax to build it up to the required thickness of about 3/8 of an inch. I had to cover every bit of every surface 4 times, so around and around I went. On the last layer, I concentrated on making an attractive texture. This would be the exact surface one would see in bronze, tool marks and all. Of course, as soon as I had a complete sculpture, then it had to be cut up to get it out the door and off to the foundry. First we sliced through the wax layer, then clipped through the chicken wire. Next we cut through the armature, but left it in place to support the wax while in transit. Now in 6 pieces, it was carefully packed up and taken to the foundry. At the foundry, each of the pieces was rigged up in a metal cage for safe handling. We wrestled out the last of the armature and chicken wire. I reworked the texture as needed, and we sealed the wax strips on the inside. Lastly, but critically, a network of wax bars were attached. These become the channels for the exit of the wax and the entry of the molten bronze. To create the casting mold, each wax section was coated inside and out with a liquid polymer. The wet surface was covered with a fine ceramic grit and left to dry before putting on the next layer. After 12 coats of liquid and grit, the molds were ready to go into the oven. The heat melted out the wax and baked the molds into hard ceramic shells. Finally, the hollow shells were hosed out to make sure there was no debris left inside. The shells were reheated to the temperature of molten bronze. One at a time, they were taken out and set up for pouring, trying to keep each one at the optimum temperature. This is crucial so the bronze flows to all parts of the empty shell quickly and evenly. If it doesn't, part of the sculpture will be missing. In the case of a unique wax like Momentum, that means I would have to remake that part from scratch. This is also why the placement of those wax channels is so important. Each section is placed in a large bin and surrounded by sand to hold it upright for the pouring. The sand also reinforces the shell on the rare occasion that there's a crack in the perimeter. The sand dams the leak and metal continues to flow into the mold. To make extra sure, this foundry uses a vacuum system, which draws the metal to all parts of the shell. Meanwhile, bronze ingots are melted and brought to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. As the molten bronze is poured into the crucible, it is skimmed to remove any impurities that have risen to the surface. At last, the pouring starts. After 7 months of my time, 2 months at the foundry, the actual pouring of the bronze takes all of 10 seconds. Immediately, this shell is set down to cool, and the next section is removed from the furnace to take its place in the stately dance. Now it was time to reassemble Momentum. All the leftover channels were cut off and each piece was cleaned up. Before the original wax was cut up, a paper template was laid on the floor, and an outline of the placement of the limbs was made using a plumb bob. Precise measurements were taken between each part of the sculpture and to the template. Using these aids and photographs, Momentum was welded back together again. After I did a final check that it was standing at the right angle, all the edges were aligned, and no unsightly grinding tool marks were left, Momentum was ready for patination. Patination is the treatment of the metal surface in order to color it and stabilize it from oxidation. For some colors, the chemicals are applied to a cold surface. More often, the metal is heated with a blowtorch. It's a real art to get the surface hot, but not too hot. After a solution of liver sulfate was applied, the outside was rubbed back and a solution of ferric nitrate was added to highlight the texture. The color on the inside was darkened to reinforce the contrast. And lastly, the patina was sealed with wax and burnished. The foundry work was done, Momentum was finished. One last step to go. Wrapped in cloth and plastic, Momentum was trucked down to Janelia farm. The lifting slings were cunningly placed, so when the sculpture rose, it was in an upright position. Then up and away it went. Down it came and slipped easily into place. Momentum had arrived at its home, and I was very happy.